Good morning. I'm Dave, and I believe in God. Usually, but not all the time. That may seem strange to hear from a preacher, but if we're honest, all of us wrestle with doubt from time to time. Even Peter, in the story we just read, he'd seen Jesus do countless miracles. He'd heard countless promises, but in his moment of fear, as the waves closed in and he was beginning to sink, suddenly he wasn't so sure anymore. After rescuing him, Jesus asks, maybe with confusion, or perhaps bemusement, "Why did you doubt?" We're in the middle of a sermon series about the questions Jesus asked. Jesus had lots of questions, 307 to be precise. So this spring and summer, we're letting him ask those questions of us. But we've got a few questions of our own. We're not always sure what we can believe. We're not always sure that God can be trusted. Like Peter, a lot of us wonder what God is doing sometimes or not doing. It makes us wonder if he's there or cares at all. So today, I want to have some honest conversation about doubt. Why we doubt, when we doubt, and how to deal honestly with our doubts, which sometimes we're afraid to even admit we have. I know that's true of you, but this doesn't worry me. Because it's not just hardened atheists who express skepticism about God. The most faithful Christian saints throughout the scriptures and throughout the centuries have all experienced doubt. Early in Genesis, Abraham's wife, Sarah, laughed out loud when the Lord promised that she'd give birth even though she was 90 years old and she'd been barren her whole life. That just seemed impossible to believe. Gideon doubted what God said was possible. He doubted God intended to say it to him. He doubted that God was speaking at all. So he demanded a miraculous sign before taking a single step. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, went into the temple to pray, but when God actually replied, Zechariah refused to believe him. Thomas, one of Jesus' hand-picked 12 disciples, earned the name Didymus, which means double. So some scholars suggest he was a twin. But more likely, it refers to him being double-minded, a Greek idiom for doubting. We often call him Doubting Thomas because even after all the miracles he'd witnessed, when his friends insisted they'd seen Jesus alive after being crucified, Thomas absolutely refused to believe it. One of my favorite examples is the father in Mark 9 whose son was sick and had come to Jesus for help. He tried all kinds of doctors and priests for years, and even Jesus' disciples couldn't cure him. Now, as a father myself, I can only imagine this man's despair, watching his son suffer for so long. And finally, after all that disappointment, Jesus gets involved. The boy is convulsing and foaming at Jesus' feet, and the father begs, "If you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." If you can? The father isn't sure. Now, he believed in Jesus enough to come, because he'd heard all kinds of amazing stories, but after suffering so long and being let down so many times, he's learned not to trust anyone anymore. "If you can," said Jesus. "Everything is possible for the one who believes." Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." Now, that's a prayer I can relate to. That's a prayer I've prayed myself. I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Some people assume that pastors never struggle with doubt. But the truth is that I probably struggle with it more than most of you. Every week I ask people to base life decisions on the truths I preach. So I feel burdened to make sure that what I say is absolutely reliable. And it's not just for you, it's for me. I'm not a casual Christian who shows up on Christmas and Easter to see if God has anything new to say this year. I've bet my family, my finances, and my future on what God promises in the Bible. So if it's not entirely trustworthy and true, I want to know ASAP. All of us who take faith seriously will struggle with doubt from time to time. We'll test it more because we depend on it more. You know, when I'm about to skate out on a frozen lake, First, I tentatively step out onto the ice and I stomp as hard as I can, because before I trust my life to that ice, I want to make sure it is rock solid. Likewise, those of us who entrust our entire lives to God should ask the hardest questions, because we can't afford to be wrong about this. And today, we get plenty of help coming up with hard questions. There's an overt campaign in our culture and in some of our schools to undermine our confidence in God. But there's a gift in that, because these people force us to ask questions about our faith that deserve good answers. And we'd probably ask those questions anyway, because they're the same questions we ask whenever we experience pain or injustice or disappointment, like Peter did in the passage we read. We wonder, why did God let this happen? Does God hear my prayers or care? Does God even exist? Like the father I mentioned earlier, we begin to wonder if God's even able to do anything to help us. These are essential questions. But whenever we ask them, doubt creeps in to attack our faith. Now, many Christians assume that doubt is bad, but I don't agree. I say it proves we're thinking. Throughout college, I sought to reconcile my newly discovered faith in Christ with my time-tested trust in science. So I taped to the mirror of my dorm all 4 years a quotation from philosopher and scientist Alfred Korzybski. Quote, "There are two ways to slide easily through life: to believe everything or to doubt everything. Both ways save us from thinking." Healthy skepticism can protect us from superficiality and superstitions by propelling us to make sure that what we believe is really true. Doubt can purify our faith from pop theology that may sound nice, but is little more than wish fulfillment that helps us avoid reality and responsibility. In a world full of fake news, sometimes I wish Christians would exercise a little more appropriate doubt before forwarding an outrageous claim they found on Facebook. Many times I initially doubt something that I've heard about God or the world, only to discover upon further examination that I was right to be dubious. Friends, I want to trust Jesus with my whole heart, but I want to be very discerning about what is true before I believe it. Occasionally, when someone informs me that they don't believe in God anymore, I ask them to describe the God they don't believe in. And I have to agree with them, because I can't believe in that distorted depiction of God either. So do doubt what God didn't say and isn't true. Jesus said, "I am the truth." Jesus wants us to search for truth, because then we'll find Him. If what we believe is real, then we should be unafraid to examine it. In fact, this is what God wants. He said in John 4:23, "True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." God wants us to have true faith, but not blind faith, because blind faith will believe things that aren't true. I don't just want a faith that feels good, when the sun is shining and my friends are many and my wallet is full. I want a true faith that stands up in the emergency rooms of life. I want a faith that is solid as a rock, so I don't have to worry about it giving way when I put my weight on it. So don't be embarrassed if you doubt sometimes. And don't criticize another Christian who raises legitimate questions, especially in moments of suffering. Jude 22 instructs us to be merciful to those who doubt. Doubting is evidence that I'm thinking and taking this seriously. But doubting can also be scary. Whenever we start asking whether God really cares or really keeps His promises or really exists, we start wondering if we can believe anything at all. We might panic that we've ruined our lives by following a fairy tale. But that's no reason to stop asking questions. Because if that's true, well, I'd rather know now than continue living a lie and trusting in something unreliable. Yeah, I face these doubts periodically, Sometimes I search them out by reading Christianity's most thoughtful critics. Other times they show up when I least want them. But in either case, I always follow the same process. First, I take a deep breath and relax. Just because I've encountered a new challenge, I don't want to immediately jettison everything I've known before. Millions of brilliant people before me, including some of the smartest scientists in history, have examined God's claims and continued to believe. So take this challenge seriously, but don't panic prematurely. Secondly, go back to square one by asking, what can I know for sure? Does God really exist? It's often suggested that science says no, but that's not true. The reality is that among university professors, the highest percentage of Christians are in the hard sciences, including biology, chemistry, and physics, because they appreciate both the insights and limitations of science. Science can help us describe what has been created and how to make one thing out of the right combination of other things, like water out of ice and heat, or an oak tree out of water, sun, soil, and an acorn. But science can never explain how to make something out of nothing. It can only prove that it's impossible to do, according to the first law of thermodynamics. So while science can help us marvel at its beauty and complexity, science can't explain how all of this energy and matter appeared in the first place, leaving us to wonder who created it and why. And science can help us recognize patterns in creation, including what's often called the second law of thermodynamics, which insists that without outside intervention, systems always move from order to disorder. The increasing levels of order and intricacy achieved through evolution would seem to contradict this well-established law, suggesting some kind of outside intervention or built-in design. Science can help us see the logical necessity for a creator and perhaps even recognize a few of his fingerprints. And while many inferences could be made about his personality or purposes from creation, most evidence would only be circumstantial. So while science helps me believe there is a supernatural force, it can't definitively reveal too much about him or her or them, but that's okay. There are many important questions that science can't answer. For example, science can describe the engineering, materials, size, location, temperature of a house, but not what makes a house a home. Likewise, science can prove the logical need for a creator, but not that this creator sees me, knows me, loves me, or is involved at all. For that, we rely on experience and history, including experiences that science could never explain because some of them defy what science tells us to expect without some kind of supernatural intervention. For this, I have not only my own experiences, but also similar stories from people in every century and country. In a courtroom, when science can't prove innocence or guilt, corroborating testimony of 2 or 3 strangers is taken to be of even higher value. Now, I don't assume that someone else's testimony isn't true just because I wasn't there to see it myself. I never met George Washington, but I don't doubt that he existed. So the corroborating testimony of literally billions of believers from every generation and culture who've experienced God's power, presence, guidance, and intervention would seem impossible to ignore. But the evidence confirming my own experiences that has always proven the most persuasive is that of the resurrection of Jesus. Skeptics have come up with alternative explanations for Jesus' apparent miracles, like the feeding of the 5,000, or the walking on the water, or healing the sick. But the resurrection's a lot harder. Jesus had warned that he'd rise again in 3 days, which neither the Roman nor the Jewish leaders believed, but they couldn't afford to let the masses get tricked. So first they made sure he was really dead by running a spear through his corpse. Then, so that nobody could steal the body and make up a story about him rising again, they not only rolled a stone in front of Jesus' tomb, they set guards all around it. But Jesus got up anyway, and many people saw him with their own eyes, including hundreds at a time. But if it were not true, I mean, if Jesus really were dead, and all those witnesses were lying, then the Romans would have gladly produced his body. But they didn't do that because it wasn't there. Some have suggested that maybe the disciples stole it somehow, accepting for a moment the implausibility that a bunch of scared fishermen could have outwitted the Roman guards. Why would they have all endured torture and given their lives to defend a story that they knew was false? And how do you account for the courage and conviction that suddenly replaced their cowardice? I've heard a few alternative explanations for Jesus' resurrection, but frankly, they're just too far-fetched to believe. And I don't have enough faith to believe ridiculous things like that. Jesus rose from the dead. That seems clear. And if he could do that, then why would we wonder whether he can walk on water? And if he could keep the impossible promise to rise from the dead, I'm pretty much ready to believe anything he says, no matter how much it may run counter to what I thought made sense before. Jesus tells me that God knows me and loves me and has a plan for me. It doesn't always seem that way, honestly, but I can believe Jesus because he is God. So he knows more about God than anyone else in history. Because I want to be sure of what I can really believe, these kinds of questions are very important to me. I first became interested in Christianity because I saw the difference it made in others' lives, and finally became a Christian because of what I experienced of God myself. But along the way, I needed to know for sure that it was true. So I read scores of books about theology and science to make sure I wasn't basing my life on a lie. And respecting my doubts enough to research them has actually protected me from doubt. When people misapply science to attack faith, I'm not duped. When people make false claims about God or Christian history, I'm not shaken because I have a firm intellectual foundation undergirding my faith. One time I met with a high rocker who'd been persuaded from experiences that Jesus is alive and involved in his life, but he has no intellectual foundation for his faith. That doesn't mean that his faith isn't real, just that it's more vulnerable to attack. So he wanted me to help him start studying so that his faith won't rest on his emotions or memories alone. So many books have helped me grow deeper in my understanding of faith and truth and science, including some luminaries like Mere Christianity, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, The Case for Christ, Know What You Believe, The Language of Science and Faith, The Reason for God, and many more, any of which are great places to find answers to many of your intellectual doubts. But then, why do people like me who've read these books continue to have doubts? Probably because while many doubts may present themselves as intellectual questions, that's not what our doubts are usually about. And this is where this sermon gets tricky. Now, I know it's been heavy already, but when I started preparing this sermon, I cataloged and answered the 17 most common sources of doubt. I knew that it would take too long, so I compressed it to the 10 most significant. But in reality, each of these could occupy an entire sermon. I was tempted to leave some for another time, but I believe these issues are essential to address if we're going to deal with our doubts. So today, I want to enumerate all 10 and respond only briefly, so that at least you have a place to begin, if this is a kind of doubt that plagues you. I know that my treatment will be inadequate, but hopefully it's a helpful start. One reason we doubt is simply intellectual. We're inadequately educated about our faith. Even after all of my reading in high school and college, when I went to seminary, I was sometimes in over my head. I was privileged to spend 3 years earning a degree at Harvard Divinity School, where my faith was often challenged by new questions that threatened to undermine my faith. I was so thankful to be working for a senior pastor who loves Jesus, is a seminary professor himself, and a true scholar. Sometimes I'd bring him arcane challenges that were rocking my faith, and I feared might overwhelm him too, only to discover that this challenge had long ago been debunked, and usually he could explain it easily right off the top of his head. I kept having these little crises of faith because I wanted to take the questions seriously. But I always discovered that there were reliable answers for why we believe the faith passed down through the ages. Some of you are vulnerable to easy challenges, not because Christianity isn't true, but because you're trying to answer college-level questions with a second grade of Sunday school level faith. Faith feeds on facts as much as experiences. So we need to keep learning. Books, Bible study, small groups, and classes are all good ways to keep growing. But it won't happen if we don't put in some effort. Luke applauded the Bereans who received the gospel eagerly, but then examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. And this is similar to the second occasion for doubt, which is when we believe spiritual sounding falsehoods. So often I find Christians shaken because God didn't keep a promise that he never made. God didn't promise that you wouldn't get sick, lose your job, get hurt, experience injustice, lose your loved ones to death, or get rejected by a prospective spouse or favorite university. And this relates closely to the third reason that we doubt: suffering. Like the father of the sick boy in the story we read earlier, perhaps we assume that if God is real and involved, then we'll never suffer pain or sadness. But in fact, God promises over and over that we will. He also promises that he'll be with us through all of it, and that he'll bring good out of even the most evil situations, and that one day there'll be a new heaven and a new earth where none of these things will ever happen again. But not yet. So let your doubt prompt you to inquire what God really promised. But don't doubt God because he didn't keep a promise he didn't make. And this is similar to the fourth cause of doubt: confusion about what God is doing. I've shared before that when I broke my back in college, it really threw me for a loop spiritually, because I couldn't possibly understand why God would allow something like that to happen to me. It's a longer story for another day, but that turned out to be an unexpected blessing, which taught me that God's ways may seem strange in the middle of the story. Don't draw conclusions too soon, because we can't always know why God is or isn't doing something, but we can always know why we trust him. If he gave up his own son for us, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? And after giving me Jesus, how can I think that he's going to hold back anything good from me? So I can say, I don't understand what you're doing in this situation, but I trust you anyway. You know, we can't always know why, but we can know why we trust the God who knows why. And this leads neatly to the fifth reason that we doubt God: idolatry. We aren't sure we can trust God to help us, not because we doubt his power, but because we want what we want more than we want God or what he wants. Scripture assures us that God loves to give us good gifts, but often what he knows is best is not what we're clamoring for. So don't trust God to give you whatever you want most. Trust God to give you whatever you need to have true peace, genuine joy, and fulfill the purposes for which he created you, which may not be what the world says will satisfy, but is better than anything the world can offer. Other times, we doubt God because we don't feel him with us. And this can be caused by several things, including our bodies. One time, Elijah was so depressed that he wanted to give up on God and die. But really, all he needed was some sleep and nourishment. In the same way, when we're exhausted, burned out, it's just that time of the month, or we're not getting enough vitamin D because there's insufficient sunshine in Boston between November and May, The solution may not be to pray more until you feel God again. It may be to take a nap, take a vacation, take some medication, join a gym. I always deal with doubt more in the winter because the lack of sun and outdoor activities drains my vitality. Don't underestimate the influence of our bodies over our souls. Others doubt God's presence because we've been ignoring Him for so long. We stop putting our faith into action, so we don't get to see God at work. These people don't lose their faith, they just don't use it anymore. And like building muscles, we need to exercise our faith in order to see it grow. If you're not taking intentional, sacrificial steps to trust and obey Jesus, your faith will atrophy, and you'll begin to doubt His power to make any difference at all, because you aren't experiencing it anymore. Obedience leads to faith, because then we can see God keeping His promises. But disobedience leads to doubts. In John 8, Jesus said, "If you hold my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Experiencing more of God is always the easiest way to answer any doubt. Number 8, many of us doubt God when we don't really want to believe that He's real, so that we don't need to obey Him. Temptation doesn't just lead to doubt, it requires doubt. An old adage holds that there are no atheists in foxholes, but the corollary could be that there are no theists in brothels. We're good at raising questions about God when He's inconvenient to believe. Just like a husband considering adultery may start finding fault with his wife or marriage in order to justify his selfishness. Perhaps some of us have authority issues. It's not that we want to sin egregiously, it's just that we don't want to have to submit to anyone or anything. So we find ways to dress up our adolescent demands for independence in intellectual-sounding arguments that justify us doing our own thing. One of those intellectual-sounding arguments is to decry all the evils perpetrated in the name of religion throughout history. Like all of these, an entire sermon could be preached against this fallacy. Yes, the church has sinned repeatedly and seriously. No surprise, since she only invites sinners to join. But she's also done more good than any other institution on earth. Christians give more money each year to address poverty than all governments combined. And every time I visit the sick, the poor, the victims of war, or the marginalized of society anywhere in the world, from Africa to India to Asia to inner city America, I find Christians, and usually only Christians, already working there to bring peace and healing. Contrary to the familiar refrain, few wars have been caused by religion. Most are caused by greed for money, possessions, or power, all of which Christianity warns against. So maybe it should come as no surprise that the worst bloodbaths in history have occurred in countries that intentionally ignored God and have forbidden faith. Stalin is said to have caused 20 million deaths, though Mikhail Gorbachev claimed it was closer to 35 million. Mao Zedong was responsible for about 70 million in China, and Hitler executed 6 million Jews and 1 or 2 million Christians in Nazi Germany. Pol Pot massacred an estimated 20% of the entire nation of Cambodia. Maybe years before we can count the millions who are being starved or executed in communist North Korea today. This is what happens, not because people are blindly following God, but because they're blindly dismissing Him. There are many reasons we doubt our faith. But in this very cursory treatment, I hope I've made the point that we need to do a better job of doubting our doubts. They may have the appearance of intellectual rigor, but often are bluffs that cover another issue entirely. Don't be afraid to ask hard questions. God will not crumble under the most rigorous examination. But many of our doubts cannot survive even the simplest scrutiny. Years ago, I was so impressed by the intellectual rigor of Christianity that I tried to pummel people into believing, thinking that if they could see all the evidence, then they'd have to believe. But that misses the main point. Christianity is more than an intellectual system. It's a relationship with the living God. So most of our hesitation starts in our hearts, not our heads. James reminds us that the demons know for sure that God exists. But there's more to faith than just believing that God exists. Real faith is a relationship with God. And like any relationship, it requires what Soren Kierkegaard famously called a leap of faith. This leap has often been misunderstood or misconstrued by people like Mark Twain, who defined faith as, quote, believing what you know ain't true. To the contrary, faith depends on facts. Our hearts cannot believe what our heads cannot accept. But facts are not enough. Many people misunderstand faith as being really convinced about something. But in actuality, it's being really committed to something that you're convinced is reasonable. My wife and I have been married for 24 years. But when we got married, there was so much I didn't know about her that I couldn't know. But despite all that, 24 years ago, I vowed to be faithful to her as long as we both shall live. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made. But it was a leap. Not a random leap into the darkness. I dated her for 5 years already, and I knew about as much as anybody could. All that research convinced me she was a great catch, but simply knowing that she was kind and fun and beautiful and humble and hardworking wasn't the same as being married to her. Marriage is a decision that no amount of facts can force you into. It isn't contrary to the facts, it's just that the facts are never enough, because marriage isn't primarily intellectual, it's relational. It's always easier to stay on the sidelines. Honestly, agnosticism makes sense to me. Not making a decision is always safer. And it's scary to trust in something I can't touch or see. But many things we can't see, like electricity or love, are still blessings to believe. And while skepticism might seem safer, it would maybe make us miss out on something wonderful. Whether the decision is to get married, or have a baby, or start a business, begin a friendship, or follow Christ, some decisions can make all the sense in the world, but still require a leap of faith. And that can be scary enough that our minds will be flooded with all kinds of doubts to justify why we shouldn't do it. Pay enough attention to those doubts to ask hard questions. If we simply pull back in fear, we'll miss out on most of the best things in life. So on a Sunday afternoon 24 years ago, Pastor Paul Borthwick asked me to make a leap, to commit myself to this woman I'd spent so long getting to know, to entrust my life to her, even though there was still so much that I couldn't know about her or the future. 24 years later, I still don't know everything about Michelle, and I still don't understand her all the time. But I've learned to trust her, and I'm 100% committed to her all the time. Even more than Michelle, I've learned in the 31 years since I committed my life to Christ that I can trust him in every situation, and I know that he has my best interests at heart. I may not always understand or even enjoy what he's doing at a particular moment, but I've learned from experience that has been confirmed by the experiences of billions of others that while I may not always get what the world tells me to want, if I trust and obey, I'll enjoy blessings the world can never know in this life, and even more in the life to come. Jesus has given the authoritative word about what God is really like. And he's in a position to know for sure what the rest of us can only guess at. So even when I don't understand what he's doing or not doing, I can believe that God exists. God loves me. God's constantly watching over me. God's preparing a place for me to be with him forever. Jesus told me so. Now, I know that some of you still have doubts. So let me close by summarizing what we should do when we encounter doubts. First, don't feel ashamed. Don't deny you have doubts. All of the most faithful saints have doubted. And those doubts can purify your faith of superstition. Second, doubt your doubts. Don't give up what you've always known just because of a sudden new challenge. Third, go back to square one and ask, what can I know for sure? Maybe you need to do some more reading or learn from other Christians. Fourth, in times of darkness, remember what you saw in the light. Don't let your feelings make you doubt what God taught you in the past. Keep good records of God's blessings and interventions so that you can be reminded of them in dark days, because God promises dark days will come. Fifth, pray, like the father in the story we read earlier. I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. This is a prayer that God can answer. I remember one time when I was really struggling with some difficult questions, and I recalled the promise in James 1:5 that if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, and it will be given to you. So I did, and in a way that amazed me, He did. In the middle of that prayer time, I discovered answers I'd never known before, which has emboldened me to pray with absolute confidence that same prayer many more times since. 6, take the leap of faith to put your faith into practice. We won't experience God if we don't follow Him into places that require faith and sacrifice. But our experiences there will be the easiest antidote to whatever doubts you have. After He died and rose again, Jesus appeared to His disciples, and Matthew 28 tells us that when they saw Him, they worshiped. But some doubted. Well, of course they doubted. Dead people stay dead. But Jesus didn't rebuke them for doubting. Instead, in the very next verse, He sent them out to make disciples and teach them about the Jesus who kept disproving their doubts. Disciples are not people who never doubt. They're people who doubt and worship. Doubt and serve. Doubt and love. Doubt and pray. Doubt and wait patiently for their faith to become sight in the age to come.